Jonathan and Jeremy, join them on their adventures and stories, learning new lessons every day, and meeting new friends along the way. It's Jonathan and Jeremy,
The Thief Fox. One morning, while Jonathan worked on his vegetable garden, he heard a great argument spring up nearby. Curious, he bent an ear in the direction of the noise and listened in. "You stole my eggs!" shouted Mrs. Blue Jay. "I did no such thing!" hissed Mr. Snake. A flap of wings was followed by a long hiss and scream. Jonathan looked up with wide eyes as Mr. Snake flew over his head and smacked against Jeremy's tree. "What's all that noise?" grumbled a sleepy Jeremy, poking his head out of his tree house. Mr. Snake dangled dace from a branch. "Please don't hurt me," he whimpered, coiling tightly around the branch. Jeremy scratched his head, like he often did when he was confused, and looked down at Jonathan, who explained the argument he'd heard. "Serves you right," murmured Jeremy with narrow eyes. He really didn't like snakes. "Don't be so quick to judge," Jonathan reprimanded and watched the snake slither down the tree's trunk. "Did you steal the eggs?" he asked. Mr. Snake shook his head and silently slithered away. Jeremy didn't trust Mr. Snake at all, but Jonathan thought Mr. Snake was being honest. The next day, while Jonathan and Jeremy played tag in the forest, they heard Mrs. Duck scream, "Thief! Give me back my eggs!" "I don't have your eggs!" hissed Mr. Snake. "Oh, my darling eggs!" Mr. Duck cried. "You took them, just like Mrs. Blue Jay's." Mr. Snake hissed loudly. "If you're so sure, come inside and see for yourself." Mrs. Duck quite loudly offended. "I'm not a fool. The moment I go in there, you'll eat me." Worried, Jonathan hopped over to Mr. Snake's nest and suggested, "Perhaps you are being too quick to judge, Mr. Snake." Mrs. Duck made a series of low quacks, ruffled her feathers, and waddled away, shouting, "You're a fool if you think he's innocent." Jonathan sighed and wiggled his nose, worried. "She's right," grumbled Jeremy, hopping away from Mr. Snake's nest. As the days went by, more and more animals lost their eggs. Everyone blamed Mr. Snake for it. Mr. Snake was so scared that he stopped coming out of his nest. One day, while playing on the other side of the forest, Jeremy spotted an egg hidden by some grass. Finding this odd, he jumped to the ground and looked around. He found 2 other eggs, then heard the grasses rustling nearby. Swinging up onto a tree branch, he watched as a fox walked by, wagging his tail proudly in the air. "I have to tell Jonathan," he thought, and swinging from the trees returned to the forest clearing, where he and Jonathan lived. "Are you sure?" Jonathan asked, when Jeremy told him what he'd seen. Jeremy nodded and couldn't stay still. "I saw the egg and the fox with my own eyes." A fox stealing eggs was a very bad thing. Foxes rarely got along with other animals and often caused conflict, with the exception of a handful who lived in the forest for years and were good neighbours. That night, when everyone slept, Jeremy and Jonathan stayed awake. They saw the fox slinking by the edge of the trees, and while later saw it go by a basket of eggs around its neck. "Let's follow it," suggested Jonathan, already hopping after the fox. "Jonathan, wait!" whispered Jeremy, scared. Jonathan didn't listen, so Jeremy swallowed his fear and went after him. They stayed back, watched the fox go inside his den, singing happily. "Now," Jonathan whispered. Silently, they walked to the fox's den, where the fox was busy placing the eggs on a shelf already full of eggs. "Unhand those eggs," Jonathan bravely said. The fox jumped, sending the egg in his hands flying through the air. "This isn't what it looks like," the fox innocently protested. Jeremy leaped up and caught the egg before it could crash to the ground. "If it's not a fox stocking up on eggs for the winter, what does it look like then?" The fox tugged his tail between his legs and looked at the floor. "I love collecting eggs. They look so lovely on my shelves." "You shouldn't take what's not yours," Jonathan said. "The owners are very worried and scared." "You should give them back before someone else takes the blame for your wrongdoings," Jeremy said, remembering Mr. Snake. The fox took a blue jay's egg and rubbed his cheek against it. "But I love them so much, I couldn't possibly give them back now." "It's the right thing to do," Jonathan and Jeremy said. Sighing, the fox put the egg down and murmured, "All right, if you insist." They watched the fox fill 3 baskets with eggs. Halfway through, he stopped and tilted his head and asked, "Do I have to give them back?" Jonathan and Jeremy nodded, leaving no room for argument. The fox did as told and walked back to the forest clearing with Jeremy and Jonathan, each carrying a basket of eggs. They arrived at sunrise, and many of the animals were already wandering around. Seeing them approach, they gathered around and listened to the fox apologize. He saw the saddened and worried faces of Mrs. Blue Jay, Mrs. Duck, and Mrs. Hen. He felt bad for taking the eggs and understood stealing was wrong. "Perhaps I can have the shells when they hatch?" the fox eagerly asked, wagging his tail. The animals looked at him thoughtfully, then said, "You can have all the shells." The fox yipped with joy, and having learned his lesson, never again took anything without asking because stealing was wrong. Hi, my name is Natalie Lawton. I'm so happy you're listening to this story with me. If you like this story, please click the like button below. Please subscribe to our channel if you'd like to watch our new video coming next. You may also find us anytime at our website, www.jonathanjeremy.com. See you.